Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we'll be talking with David Mora about a recent election in Mexico, where judges were on the ballot. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Well, Kelly, it's been a couple of weeks. How are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. Some updates for our listeners. I know everybody was on the edge of their seats, eagerly anticipating the outcome of the 2A Vienna Little League baseball season. True to our name, the McFarland Underdogs finished the season in last place. We finished 1-9-1, but when we went to the playoffs, we actually won our first two games in the playoffs and made it to the Final Four and lost to the eventual champions in the semifinal in a walk-off 5-4. So I was very excited for the kids to win a couple games in the playoffs. And let me tell you, it got real, man. It was exciting. There was the intensity in the playoffs it really spiked.
I mean, one of the things that particularly fascinates me is how, with a, shall we call it a remarkable record like that, does one get into the playoffs?
Everybody makes the playoffs.
Everybody's a winner.
Yeah. But I also like to chalk it up to coaching. The kids got better and better all season long, and we were actually really playing well at the end of the season and had a few close games going in to the playoffs. So it was exciting. And then tomorrow's last day of school here in Northern Virginia. So my kids will be done with school, and then it's off to different camps every week for the summer and all that kind of stuff. But we have a fun little tradition at our bus stop in my neighborhood where when the kids get off the bus the last day, we have a squirt gun and water balloon fight and everything. So that'll be pretty exciting tomorrow. The kids are looking forward to that. So Hong Kong is nearer and nearer.
It is. We are less than 2 months to go. And so the move itself is getting real. And before then, we've got our diplomatic summer academy here in Cambridge. And so that's less than a month to go. And so between the two projects, life is pretty busy right now, but very, very exciting.
Yeah, I imagine you are living in a world of logistics right now.
I am nothing but a series of spreadsheets.
Aren't we all in some fashion?
Yeah. Well, let's turn to the world outside of our relatively small lives.
Yeah.
I think today we're going to talk about the election results out of Poland and South Korea. And we'll also turn to the escalating violence from an Al-Qaeda affiliate in West Africa. Before, as you mentioned, we'll turn to our interview with David Mora, where we'll discuss Mexico's first ever judicial elections.
Yeah. So to start us off, let's talk about these Polish elections. So Poland just had its regular presidential election on June 1st. Longtime listeners of the podcast might remember that back in 2023, we covered Poland's last parliamentary elections, which saw former Prime Minister Donald Tusk make a surprise return to politics. Folks might remember that he was president of the European Council until 2019 when he decided to run again in Poland. Before that, he was prime minister in Poland from 2007 to 2014. So he won a narrow election in 2023, which was a big shift. And the reason we talked about it was because before that, Poland had been taking, with the Law and Justice Party, a rightward slant on things, starting to move into what we would kind of term the illiberal space, or very much more right-wing, cracking down on a lot of freedoms and things like this. And so we saw this as a positive win for democracy. And over the course of the last couple of years, Tusk and his party have been trying to undo a lot of these more authoritarian-esque things that Law and Justice has done. Now, it seems with the presidential election, that the pendulum has maybe swung yet again, because Law and Justice, that party that left the prime ministership with Tusk coming in, just had their candidate elected, Karol Nawrocki, and he won the election 51 to 49%. So this means that Law and Justice is going to maintain their hold on the presidency at least until 2030. So we've got this split government in Poland. So Tristan, what's your take on this, between not just what this means for the future of Poland moving out of this illiberal era that they had, but then also what does it mean for foreign policy? And are they going to be capable of doing this with these two drastically different parties, both kind of having different power sources?
Well, it's certainly going to be interesting to watch because exactly as you outline, these are two very different parties on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And indeed, it's important to highlight just how close this election was. On election night, some exit polls, which are normally pretty accurate, predicted that Tusk's preferred candidate, the Warsaw mayor, was slightly ahead. Just a few hours later, the polls declared Nawrocki the winner. And a little bit about this new president first. Nawrocki came to prominence in a pretty unusual way. He's a historian, which in and of itself, not a terrible thing.
No, I would agree with you on that one.
Yeah, he worked for and eventually led some of Poland's most prominent historical societies. He was director of the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk and led the Institute of National Remembrance, a position that actually requires election by the Polish parliament. And throughout his career, he established himself as a vocal, popular historian and kind of activist. He wrote books and articles about Polish resistance to communism and has also been a fierce critic of social liberalism, most notably, or quite notably at least, writing that the movement for LGBTQ rights is a threat to Poland, which of course plays to the country's large Catholic and conservative population. The main thing he campaigned on in this election was a promise to limit Tusk's power. Now, the Polish president is not really a head of government in quite the same way as, say, the American president is. Mr. Tusk, for example, will attend international summits and do most of the day-to-day business of governing. The Polish president, however, can veto legislation, and it now takes 3/5 of a majority in parliament to overrule him. And frankly, Tusk does not have this. And so it means that certainly domestically, not a whole lot's going to change. President Duda, the current president, was already vetoing many of Tusk's bills. And basically, I think we can certainly expect for this to continue. Now, in the case of the new president, Nawrocki, we can certainly look at how he'll affect Poland's relationship with the EU. The Law and Justice Party over the last decade has packed Poland's judiciary and weaponized its judicial watchdog to punish judges who disagree with the government. And the president's powers mean that Tusk will continue to face vetoes when he tries to claw back Poland's judicial independence. Now, for the EU, Poland's judiciary really is a big issue. EU law forbids judicial politicization, and it has tens of billions of euros earmarked for projects in Poland, which has been frozen unless Poland reverses some of these changes to its judicial system. And the argument has been going on for quite a few years and has really seen the right wing in Poland whip up a lot of anti-EU sentiment, claiming that this is quote-unquote our money. And they, of course, bring this argument to the electorate. It has resonance. Tusk did manage to get some of the money unfrozen, but he will struggle a lot to finish these reforms with the president's veto hanging over him. And so certainly EU officials will be watching the next few months in Poland very closely and possibly think about refreezing some of the funds that they feel that progress has stopped. Turning to international politics, and look, we certainly need to think about Poland with respect to Ukraine. And here the picture, I think, is a little less clear. Nawrocki is obviously a historian who, based on his work, is certainly not a big fan of Russia. And he himself is wanted by Putin because he took down Red Army statues a few years ago. That said, at the same time, he has shown a little more opposition to Ukraine than President Duda. And Poland houses around 1 million Ukrainian refugees and has spent a lot of money on the war. Positive sentiment towards Ukraine within Poland over a year has worn a little thinner, which reflects as well the new president's views. But he still condemns Putin and Russia. So I think here we're not looking at any too drastic change, but it's worth keeping an eye on this. And then finally, it's important to think about the new president's relationship with NATO and the US. And he and the Law and Justice Party are very pro-NATO and very pro-US. I think a relationship that we ought to be paying attention to is Nawrocki's with President Trump. And we may see him very much like the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, acting as a critical bridge between Europe and NATO and the current American administration.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things, I mean, we'll see how this whole Ukraine thing plays out. But like you said, I feel fairly optimistic because the Law and Justice has been so pro-NATO and pro-US. They had been moving towards increasing defense spending even before the war in Ukraine. So for me, the big thing is, how is this going to continue to affect Tusk and his party's efforts to roll back a lot of that authoritarian style things that Law and Justice had put in place before, with the politicization of the judiciary, and they threw out the entire state-run media and put a lot of the media under their power and put in their cronies and things like that. Our big question when we did a piece on Poland in 2023 was, how effective was Tusk and his party going to be at rolling that stuff back? Because it would be a good bellwether for other countries that might move away from this illiberal model in the future. So I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch, is, are they able to move forward in some ways and not in others, and everything.
We're moving on then to the South Korean elections, which were held earlier this month on June the 3rd. And these were some of the most dramatic elections in its modern history. Lee Jae-myung, the left-leaning Democratic Party candidate, defeated conservative Kim Moon-soo of the People Power Party with a historically high turnout of 79%. Lee has secured more than 49% of the vote, while Kim trailed at 41%. And so Lee began his single 5-year term in office just last week. Now, the election was originally scheduled for 2027, but a snap election was triggered by extraordinary political events late last year that our listeners may remember. Back in December 2024, then President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, sparking massive protests, and ultimately they led to his ousting by the Constitutional Court in April. Lee's resistance to the martial law attempt made him quite famous, particularly in one episode where he climbed the fence around the National Assembly to live stream his protest. And then on the campaign trail, Lee leader promised to bring to justice supporters of the failed martial law attempt and to introduce tighter controls on the president's ability to declare martial law. And Lee's victory also represents a historical political comeback at a personal level for him. He lost to Yoon in the 2022 presidential elections by less than 1% of the vote and survived an assassination attempt then in early 2024. So, Kelly, with Lee Jae-myung now poised to take office, what will his win mean for South Korea's democratic institutions, for its regional diplomacy, and of course, for its alliance with the United States?
Yeah, as you noted, I think it's imperative to re-emphasize the fact of just how big these elections were in light of what has happened in the past 7-8 months in South Korea, like the martial law and the impeachment of the president and arresting him and all these different things was a real nightmare for democracy in South Korea since late 2024. So I think we have to take a step back at the beginning just to understand that, like, it's important that they held elections, they went smoothly, and the South Koreans now have a chance to start fresh and move forward without all of the drama and things that were going on before. So that, I think, is a good thing. Remains to be seen how it pans out in the long term. But let's start with just how Lee got here. And he is an interesting and inspirational story, sort of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy. He started working as a child laborer in a factory and worked his way up to become a human rights and labor lawyer before he entered politics. And you mentioned this wasn't his first rodeo as far as presidential runs have gone. So this was actually his third run for president. But as you can imagine, the martial law crisis really gave him a political lifeline and turned many voters away from the right wing People Power Party. And it's funny, I'm researching for a new class I'm teaching in the fall on America's 1930s. And I'm reading all about the election of 1932. And Herbert Hoover could have walked on water and still not won the election in 1932, right? Because he was so far. I feel like this was kind of like you could have stuck anyone out there against the People Power Party at this point, and they would have had a good shot of winning this election. So it really helped him because of just the baggage that the PPP had going into this election. But Lee also played a central role in impeaching former President Yoon. Like you mentioned, him climbing the wall. I mean, that obviously gained a lot of eyeballs, and it really framed him as a kind of principled opposition figure. His opponent, Kim Moon-soo, on the other hand, struggled to unite conservatives. There was public battles within his party over whether he should even be the nominee. And most importantly, in terms of public image, he also did very little to distance himself from his predecessor's martial law legacy, which obviously hurt his credibility going into those elections. So now, with the left wing Democratic Party in control of both the presidency and the National Assembly, I think Lee has a window to really pass some legislation here. He's already promised to introduce tighter checks on presidential emergency powers, which would hopefully prevent the kind of future martial law scenarios that South Korea dealt with last year. And given his progressive background, he also campaigned on reducing economic inequality. And he's previously pushed for a 4.5-day work week, which I'm sure a lot of people would enjoy. I know I would. On foreign policy, Lee faces just as difficult a challenge in trying to balance relations as multiple countries do in this region, right? Balancing relations with the US, China, Japan, and North Korea. Lee and his Democratic Party are generally known to be a little less hawkish on China than the People Power Party. And also, in light of that, Washington has tended to be a bigger fan of President Yoon because he was more hawkish on China. And Yoon was also very tough on North Korea. And he made a lot of steps to normalize and improve relations with Japan, especially on military cooperation vis-a-vis China, which you can imagine the United States was very happy with. People might recall that a couple years ago, there was actually like the first US, Japan, South Korea summit. And we've talked about it on the show before, I'm sure at some point, but obviously South Korea and Japan still have extremely fraught relations in some terms because of the legacy of World War II and enforced labor of South Koreans and comfort women and things like this. And there's still disputed islands that they're dealing with and stuff too. So while they both sort of face this China challenge, they haven't come together to face this challenge in ways that the United States and multiple administrations of both parties in the US would have wanted them to. So that's something that he's going to have to deal with and walk the line on. But at the same time, Lee has historically been a lot less keen on all of this. He did moderate a little bit during the campaign, which is pretty much par for the course, as most people usually tack to the center when you're looking at a general election. So it wasn't too surprising. We'll have to see how he actually governs, though, once in office. He did, though, in the lead up to the election, promise to improve ties with Washington and Tokyo. This might be more difficult in terms of the US, though, because of the tariff issues. Trump recently announced tariff hikes on steel and aluminum products, which could further worsen South Korea's economic growth. And this really puts Lee under a lot of pressure because he's focused on economic equality a lot. So he's going to want to reach a deal and prevent any serious damage to South Korea from these tariffs. And Trump, like he has with others in the region and around the world, really has repeated calls for the country to pay more for the cost of U.S. military presence. But the U.S. is still counting on South Korea to help be a large deterrent to China and what they're trying to do in their ambitions in the region. So America needs South Korea, and we'll have to see how this all plays out. On North Korea, Lee has pledged to reopen dialogue and restore military hotlines and try to revive denuclearization talks. So this is in stark contrast to his predecessor. But again, we are dealing now again with the president in the United States who actually met Kim Jong-un. So this might not be that big of a discrepancy between the US and South Korea. So we'll have to see if there's any big, beautiful letters being exchanged in the future again, like there were in the first Trump administration. Bottom line, it's a major turning point, basically fueled by the collapse of the other party and public outrage over martial law. And it does offer I won't say necessarily a chance, but it does bring us to a point where we may see swings in South Korea's positioning in foreign affairs in the region. So definitely something to watch as we go forward because it is such an important area for the United States and for the world. All right, moving on to our third story this week, we're going to look at the Sahel, where an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and I'm not going to murder you with this long name, but we're going to call it JNIM for short, has dramatically stepped up an insurgency campaign. The Islamist militant group is responsible for one of the deadliest 30-day periods in the region in years. Over the past few weeks, JNIM has carried out waves of high-casualty attacks on military bases in Burkina Faso and Mali, killing hundreds of soldiers and overrunning several towns. Last month, the group claims that it killed over 200 soldiers in an attack on an army base in Burkina Faso. Since 2019, the group has killed nearly 6,000 civilians, and about 10,000 civilians have been killed by government-allied militias in the region. And these attacks have come amid an ongoing effort by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to deepen military cooperation through their new alliance, the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, which was created after all three nations withdrew from ECOWAS earlier this year. But this alliance has not been able to stop the terrorist group from staging attacks and enforcing Sharia law in a lot of the more rural areas of the region. So, Tristan, we've seen JNIM evolve from a fringe actor into a major insurgent force at this point. What's behind this, and how are the local and international actors responding?
Well, look, it is a troubling picture. JNIM is no longer just an extremist group operating in the shadows. Today, it is one of the most powerful Islamist insurgencies in the world, with up to about 6,000 fighters operating across Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and now parts of Benin and Togo as well. And the group's expansion is so rapid that analysts say it is effectively creating a proto-state, including taxing residents and controlling road systems in some areas. And of course, there are some obvious parallels and flashbacks to ISIS here, right? Last year, an astonishing 51% of global terrorism deaths were in the Sahel. So we need to think about how we got here. First, and if not foremost, JNIM has taken advantage of poor governance across the Sahel. In Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they have all seen successful coups in the past 5 years. In Mali, for example, a military junta came to power in 2020, promising stability and a crackdown on armed groups. However, state-sponsored and indiscriminate violence against civilians, often alongside Russian mercenaries operating under the Wagner Group, have lowered trust, somewhat understandably, in state institutions. And violence has driven recruitment amongst armed groups, including JNIM. Another reason for this surge is that JNIM has established basic governance systems in otherwise underserviced rural areas, giving it the capacity to target urban and administrative centers and even raid the government's own bases for weapons and supplies. And in the past, JNIM has targeted symbols of foreign influence in the region, including notably French and UN forces, as well as Russian mercenaries that fight with Malian troops. One particularly dangerous trend to watch out for is whether JNIM's networks begin to stretch out into more stable countries such as Ghana, Senegal, Guinea. And another factor that we absolutely have to take into account here is that the capacity of the international community to assist has shrunk significantly. The United States, notably, has withdrawn most of its military presence in the region, with only 200 troops left compared to about 1,400 in 2023. And just last year, the US withdrew its last base in Niger, where troops use sophisticated drones to track militant groups and then share that intelligence with Niger's military. We've got a resulting power vacuum, and in that power vacuum, Russia's presence in the Sahel, chiefly through the Wagner Group, has greatly expanded, with at least 1,000 troops in Mali alone. And from August 2023 through August 2024, analysts have noted an 81% increase in violence involving Russian mercenaries. And of course, the Wagner Group is presently in the process of being restructured after the helicopter crash in which the ostensibly accidental death of its leader, Evgeny Prigozhin, happened, and it's being replaced with the so-called Africa Corps, which will apparently play the same role as the Wagner Group in spreading Russian influence, principally by armed force in the Sahel. So, in all, we've seen a region where the US withdrawal has meant that coup leaders, some backed by Russian mercenaries, commit human rights abuses and destabilize the region. Abuses and poor governance has made it easier for extremist groups like JNIM to recruit and extort taxes from communities. And so we really have to keep watching this situation and see whether JNIM transitions to a strategy of holding and indeed governing territory full time. But at least right now, it certainly seems quite successful at spreading its movement simply by taking advantage of weak governments and a fundamental lack of capacity to govern.
Yeah, I think that's the key here, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening in what we've been calling sort of the coup belt over the past couple years, and increasingly poor governance and corrupt governments and ties to Russia and other mercenary groups. I don't think there's a coincidence between what's happening there and what's worsening and what we're seeing in the governance structures there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that ends our news roundup. We now move to our conversation on Mexico's latest election, where citizens voted on their Supreme Court judges. So joining me today is David Mora, a senior analyst for Mexico at the International Crisis Group. David researches organized crime, violence, corruption, and conflict in the country, blending fieldwork and investigative reporting tools. He analyzes and formulates policy strategies aimed at preventing, mitigating, or resolving conflict. Originally an investigative reporter and documentary producer, David has 8 years of experience in journalism, working for Vice News, NBC News, ProPublica, and The Atlantic. His coverage of migration, criminal violence, and corruption in Mexico has been recognized with some of the most prestigious journalism awards in the United States. Before doing journalism, he worked as a human rights researcher for different civil society groups in Mexico. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back. And as I noted, we are joined today by David Mora, who's coming to us from Mexico City to talk about recent elections for the judiciary in Mexico and to talk a little bit about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. David, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kelly, for having me.
So let's start off talking about those judiciary elections. So we know that on June 1st, Mexico held nationwide elections to its judiciary. And this is not a normal thing in democracies. Here in the US, we have a few states that elect statewide judges, but a national election for judges is pretty unheard of. So can you walk us through a little bit quickly? What was this? What were these reforms and why did they do it? Why now?
Yeah, definitely. As you said, this is not normal. Mexico is the largest democracy that has ever tried this experiment. As you said, some US states have these for local judges. I think Switzerland, they also elect, in some of the cantons, they also elect local judges through the popular vote. Bolivia, I think they elect some national judges at the highest courts level, not like every single judge, which is what we had in Mexico this past Sunday. We elected over 2,600 judges from, the entire Supreme Court bench to local judges in 19 different states. So In many ways, this is historic, right? But you can interpret historic in different opposing ways. From the perspective of the government of President Claudia Sheinbaum, this is historic because it made Mexico the quote unquote the most democratic country in the world. From the perspective of opposition parties and critics to the move, critics to the reform and the election, this is historic because Morena, the president's party, the ruling party, finally gained control over the third branch of government that it didn't have under its thumb in the past. Because Morena controlled, of course, the executive through President Claudia Sheinbaum and her predecessor, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but also they have a supermajority right now in both chambers of Congress. So it was kind of like the way for them, according to critics, to gain control over the judiciary as well. So again, you can interpret historic from different perspectives. But to understand how we got here, we need to take some steps back to understand how this reform and how this election came to be. First of all, it's the product of a reform, a major overhaul that was passed last year in Congress. Electing judges through the popular vote at the ballot box wasn't the only change that was introduced. There was a reform that went over that and that also changed other aspects of how the judiciary works. This was, of course, the most crucial part of the reform, and that's why the reform sometimes is boiled down to just electing judges at the ballot box. But just to be fair, it also contained other aspects of how the court system operates. And why this major reform? It had to do, and this is something that may resonate with the US audience a lot because of what the US is going through right now. It came from continuous clashing between the president and the court system. When López Obrador was elected as president in 2018, he won by a landslide. And his party, Morena, also gained majorities in the two chambers of the legislative. When he was implementing his agenda, the only check on his power were the courts. And time again and again, different courts, different judges stopped his policy, different like agenda items that he had in place that he was trying to push forward. So the courts became, according from the perspective of the president, the enemy to his agenda.
Right.
And he began clashing, as I said, with not only judges at the district level, but also with justices, ministras, as we call them in Mexico. He began accusing them in his daily pressers, las mañaneras. He began accusing judges by name, calling them out by name, and accusing them of general wrongdoing, from corruption to being motivated by ulterior motives or responding to private interests.
Sounds familiar to the US right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So Mexico was coming from that continuous, very adversarial relationship between the two branches of government. So when he was close to his term ending as president, he proposed this major reform for the judiciary. We were close to having general elections, hoping that his party was going to win again, even with more votes. And his strategy worked. Last year, when President Claudia Sheinbaum was elected, Morena gained even further votes, and they gained to control with a supermajority, which means 2/3 of both chambers. And it was only in 10 days since the new legislative took over until it was approved, this judicial reform. They fast-tracked the discussions and everything. That they approved the reform in 10 days. So again, this kind of like supports the critics' perspective that was the judicial reform and the judicial elections was just a way for Morena to control the judiciary, which until now was not completely under the control of the ruling party.
So I've also heard arguments about the fact that obviously the violence and cartel issues in Mexico is a huge problem. And I've also heard arguments that say that making the judiciary an elected body from the top to the bottom also makes it easier for the cartels to get their guy in. Is that credible, that argument, or where is that fitting into all of this?
So I think I will respond to that in two ways. The first one is that we had a few candidates that had alleged ties to organized crime groups. And the reason why this came to be is because the selection process of who's got to, throw their name on the ballot to be elected as a judge was a pretty weak process. The mechanisms that were in place to vet the candidates set really low bars.
Yeah.
The control processes that they had they were doing like a massive amount of work. They were going over, I think it was up to 50,000 people who throw their names because they wanted to be candidates. And they only had a few weeks to go through all these names, vet them, see if they had all the requirements. Even though the bar was set really low, they still needed to see if they were to evaluate the probity of all the candidates, all the people who wanted to be candidates. So because this process was very convoluted, we ended up with names that are very controversial. And a group of those names are the ones who have alleged ties to organized crime. And I want to add some nuance here, because there's the name of this former attorney to El Chapo, Joaquin Lopez Guzman, the kingpin who is now in prison in the US. She was part of his legal team a few years in the past. So she's been pointed out as a lawyer for the cartels. And I think everyone has the right to have legal representation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like, even if you are the worst criminal ever, you still have the right to have a lawyer arguing on your behalf. And B, until something specific is proven about that person in terms of corruption, how they conducted their defense, et cetera, et cetera. And only until then we can say, okay, this might not be, or there are problems with this specific candidate. But yeah, so we have names that, there's, for instance, another name that is making the rounds a lot in the news media here in Mexico, because this person was behind the bars in the US for a few years. Then when he came back to Mexico, he ended up running to be elected as a judge. So you have these controversial profiles, and they're just the end result of a very weak process of vetting who the candidates, right? The names that ultimately appeared on the ballot box. So that's the first way to respond to the organized crime electing judges question. There's another response which is more complex, and that is electing judges really going to help Mexico fight the huge problem that it has in terms of organized crime and violence? And the answer to that is most likely not. And why is that? Because the problems with the Mexican justice system are multiple, and they have a million different factors. From the moment that a crime is committed to the moment that a judge rules in whatever way it is, that process, there are like hundreds of persons that intervene, from the police who investigate the crime to the prosecutor who builds up and presents the case in front of a judge, and everything that happens during the trial. So you have like a million different factors playing into the problem. And just by addressing the very last step, which is the judge, and if the judge is elected or was appointed through whatever means, it's going to hardly have an impact in everything that happened prior to that. So impunity in Mexico answers to those factors, like very undersourced, poorly trained prosecutors, investigators, a lot of corruption within prosecutor offices, a lack of capacity, lack of technology, a lack of forensic procedures, et cetera, et cetera. Those problems also help explaining why 99% of crimes in Mexico are not prosecuted. Again, so when you come and you promise that the entire system is going to be more effective, which is basically the promise of the government, and it's basically the reason why they were pushing this forward, saying that this is going to end impunity. But when you're just trying to have an impact in the very last step of the chain of the process, this is hardly going to bring any change in the overall justice system and the many different problems that it has in the entirety of the criminal process. So in that sense, we hardly believe that this election is going to have a major impact on the challenges that Mexico faces in terms of violence and organized crime.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the United States, the justice system in the United States is much larger than just the judges. And like you said, it's a bigger macro issue with the justice system, and you're not going to fix it with one aspect of it. It's a whole of system attempt that needs to be made. And both countries have their challenges, obviously. But looking at the election itself, I know voter turnout was extremely low. So what does that mean in terms of the legitimacy of this? And can you read anything yet into the results of the election?
Right. So as you said, Kelly, the turnout was especially low. 13% of eligible voters showed up and cast their ballots. About 100 million people can vote in Mexico. Not all of them vote. In a general election, it's around 60 million. I think this is the lowest turnout that's been ever recorded for any election since Mexico transitioned to a multi-party system in the mid-90s. Maybe a parenthesis, there was another election a few years in the past, in 2021, that had even a lower turnout, but that was not a direct election. People were not voting to elect people into office. It was more of a referendum, a yes, no type of election. And those elections are generally, they see lower turnouts.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that this was the lowest turnout for a direct election ever held in Mexico. And this, I do believe, is going to have impacts on the legitimacy of the judiciary that was elected. And why is that? We tend to follow what a judge says because we as a society, we agree on that they're legitimate, right? Because
Right.
judges are judges.
Yes.
Especially when we're talking about more abstract things about constitutionality of things and whether some legal procedures were right or wrong. We believe in courts, and that's why we generally follow a court's order.
Right. It's the rule of law. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But when courts and judges are politicized and they are subject to the electoral logic, that means that somehow their legitimacy is read in terms of how they were voted. If they were voted, like the legitimacy might be measured against the votes that they gained
Yeah.
in the last election. And that is problematic because I totally imagine an extremely popular figure. We're talking about maybe the next AMLO, someone who was elected into office by millions and millions of votes, and suddenly clashing with a court order, with a court ruling, and saying, you know what, I'm not going to follow that order. I'm not going to follow what the judge says because I had more votes than the judge. And we can, again, this is more hypothetical, but it would be hard to argue against that. You and I, we might agree that you have to follow the order because the judge is the judge. But since the legitimacy of the courts is now under the logic of how many votes you get to be elected, the power of the rulings can also be measured against that rule. And in Latin America, in Mexico, we have plenty of experiences of extremely popular elected officials who decide not to follow the law. And now this is just going to add another argument. Again, I'm just talking scenarios.
Yeah.
It's just saying, I got more votes than you. Why do I have to follow that? If the next president pushes a law that is very controversial and turns out the Supreme Court strikes it down, the president might as well say, I had more votes than all of you combined. So why should I listen to you?
Yeah. A 13% turnout doesn't lend itself to a strong basis.
Exactly. And especially when we talk about the outcome, many of the judges, especially at the high courts level, have also really close ties to Morena, the ruling party. So it's kind of impossible to put the genie back in the lamp once the measure that you're using for everything is, like, let's go to the polls and see who gets more votes.
So moving to the broader issue of U.S.-Mexico relations, I know there's been, right off the bat with the new Trump administration, there was proposed increased tariffs on Mexico. Sheinbaum and Trump had some phone conversations, and some of those were backed off. There's still some in place. There obviously have discussed this issue of immigration and the cartels and violence and the drugs and everything. We're about 5 months in now to this relationship and Trump being back in office. Where do you see the U.S.-Mexico relationship right now?
So I think there are like two opposing views on how to address the issue of organized crime in Mexico. The one that comes from Washington right now, we see that is more militaristic. They're beefing up the military presence on the U.S. side of the border. They are happy with some of the moves that Sheinbaum did earlier in the year of deploying more troops, more Guardia Nacional troops to this side of the border. It's been a few weeks now since the last report, but last month, there were a lot of buzz on the media, on the U.S. media, about the White House discussing potential drone strikes in Mexico, even without Mexico's approval of the move. So in that sense, President Trump's White House is pushing for this more militaristic approach. While Sheinbaum has so far stood her ground and defended her government and the country against this rhetoric by showing that her administration is willing to do more law enforcement cooperation, is willing to halt and take a more active approach against organized crime. She's also put a lot of reforms, legal reforms in place to strengthen the law enforcement agencies in Mexico. Her administration is also detaining, prosecuting, and even extraditing more high-value targets, something that the Trump administration welcomes. We also have the transfer of 29 major drug figures from Mexico to U.S. prisons. So far, she's been standing her ground, showing that Mexico is doing more and can do more, as long as that means collaborating more with the U.S. In that state of things, we have the judicial election and the results. And I think that if the end result of this, it's still too early. The votes are just being counted. We still don't have final results. But in a few months, maybe 1 year or so, if it turns out that the judges that were elected actually make the entire court system weaker, that is going to come as another argument for the Trump administration, as yet another reason for that militaristic approach, right? Like, look, basically in their view could be like Mexico's law enforcement and the criminal justice system can't deal with organized crime groups. So we might as well just fly drones and bomb cartels. I hope that is not the case. But again, it's too early to see what the end result for the system, for the justice system as a whole of these elections is going to be. It might turn into another argument in favor of the militaristic approach or not.
Interesting point, too, to add to that. I just read the new director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has also, in a massive shift in U.S. intel priorities, has also shifted a lot of intel collection and analysis to sort of Mexico, the border, cartels, things like that. So that kind of also fits in line with what the Trump administration is focusing on. And I think that will be another part of this that maybe we don't see as much of in the news, and is sort of this intel. Maybe there's an increased intel sharing between the U.S. and Mexico, which wouldn't be a bad thing at the end of the day. And it would be, if that's able to be something that Sheinbaum and the Mexicans can work out with the U.S., I think that would be a good way to help placate the Trump administration as well, by being open and sharing as much intel as possible. Still a lot to be, we're 5 months into a 4-year term here in the U.S. So
we're also like 7 months into a 6-year term here of Sheinbaum.
Yeah, this relationship's going to be going on for a while. So,
Exactly.
Well, listen, David, I really appreciate it. And thanks for the time.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks again to David for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.